Today, I'm going to share with you the story of a man who feared his own breath. And that fear took away his relationships, shrank his world, and nearly cost him his life. My goal with sharing this patient story is this, that by the end of it, you'll better understand how anxiety works, how it manifests in our lives, but also how vulnerable it is to some of the strategies I share with you today. Because once you understand the hidden principles that prop up anxiety, you'll then have the tools to be able to knock it down and reclaim your life. And we'll also talk about this concept of core fears, that most intense fear about whatever it is in your life that you care about that has a grip over you. But for those of you who are new to the channel, welcome. I'm Dr. Robert. I'm a board certified psychiatrist. So let's talk about that case I mentioned. I'll call the patient Jack. He was quite literally terrified of his own breath. More specifically, he was afraid that someone would smell his breath and find it disgusting, off-putting. And over time, how this started to dominate his life is he stopped leaving his apartment. If he wanted food, was hungry, he'd have to order it to his apartment, wait for the person to leave, put on the mask, step into the hallway, grab his food, and then eat it on his own. Even in his own apartment, he would keep a mask on just in case. That's how dominating this fear was. You may think it's irrational, and he did too, but it was there, and it was dominating his every single thought and action. Before I share with you how this fear originally manifested for Jack, how it evolved over the years, and almost led to the collapse of his life, I want to share with you what a core fear is. Basically, a core fear is a term we use for a very ingrained fear, something we're very afraid of, and oftentimes it's very personal and about something we care a lot about. We all have them to some degree. It's also the center point of what drives severe anxiety, and particularly OCD. To be clear, there's a lot of variants of OCD, and not all of them have a very clear core fear, but for the most part, they do. Some common examples are this: I'm unsafe, I'm unlovable, I might harm someone inadvertently, I might do something that's a mistake and collapses my life and changes it irrevocably. If something goes wrong, it'll be all my fault. Those are just some of the more common ones, but there are many more out there. So many anxious thoughts and feelings can be traced back to this core fear. There are three important principles that prop up core fears. The more ashamed you are of a core fear, the more power it gains over you. The more you work to silence it and hide it, the louder it becomes. The more you try to avoid it, the larger it grows. Many of my patients with severe anxiety or OCD, they can't even say their core fear out loud for many months of sessions before they're actually able to voice it. It's that frightening to them. It almost feels dangerous to admit. So often there are all these layers of shame, guilt, fear, avoidance that keep it surrounded and keep it alive. So now that you have a basic understanding of core fears, let's go to Jack's story and see how it actually crystallized for him early on in childhood. So Jack was always an anxious kid to some degree. He was kind of genetically predisposed to it. He had anxious parents. His father likely struggled with OCD, though never diagnosed. When he was very young, he had severe separation anxiety. He had a lot of small rituals he liked to self-soothe with when he was very young. Nothing very extreme, but the seeds of anxiety and OCD were already there. And on top of it, he and his family were always moving because of his father's work. And this led to a lot of recurrent change and lack of stability. His parents also had a lot of conflict at home, so he was absorbing that as well, and that was bringing on anxiety and a lack of a desire to share some of his anxiety with them because he didn't want to make them more anxious, more upset than they already were. So halfway through the 6th grade, middle school, which was already a pretty tough time for most kids, he moved and he had to start at a new school. And he very clearly remembers going to school that first day. All the kids were already friends with each other, cliques were made. He was very hyper aware of himself, very anxious, and very hyper attuned to any criticism or bullying or anything like that. And sitting in that cafeteria, he was sitting on his own, tried to join some kids, didn't really fit in, so he just kind of sat there, and some other kids sat next to him. And a kid kind of looked at him after a minute and said, "Dude, your breath stinks." Which, this is just some stupid middle school kid stuff. But for Jack in that moment, all of his anxiety, all of the tension he was already experiencing prior to this, everything that was going on, all of it sort of just crystallized. Something in him really latched onto that comment. It seemed to fuse every insecurity he had. And suddenly his brain went into overdrive. Will I never make friends because of my bad breath? Will people avoid me because of my bad breath? Is this something that makes me unlovable? Will I ever be normal? Will I ever be able to make friends because of this? What if it happens again? And all of these ruminations, these fears, everything was running through his mind. And when he came home, he felt too ashamed of it. He didn't want to bring this up to his parents. They were already tense. The move was fresh. And the last thing he wanted to do was bother them, burden them with his recent experience, with his anxiety. This, he decided, was a fear he would keep to himself. So now his world shrinks. He began to cover his mouth whenever he spoke to anyone. He began brushing his teeth after every meal and then rinsing his mouth between meals. He would constantly also monitor. He would check his breath. People started to comment about that. People did notice he was always kind of huffing his breath and stuff like that. But he'd almost rather people make fun of that than his breath. That was a safer thing. The safety behaviors around this grew more extensive and more ingrained as the years went on. He rarely spoke to people, never spoke to strangers, and always avoided social contact as a result. And then the pandemic hit. And for a little while, he was like, yes, finally. Now the whole world doesn't think my anxiety is weird. Now everybody masks, everybody stays home. And actually, ironically enough, gave him a brief period of respite, of feeling a little bit more normal. And before I get to what was the breaking point for him, I'm sure the astute viewers there recognize this as OCD, right? This is an obsessive compulsive disorder where the obsession is around his breath, that's the high anxiety state, and then the compulsion is the avoidance of making sure other people under any circumstance are ever exposed to his breath. And this cycle reinforces itself and grows more ingrained and starts to dominate one's life. So very classic OCD, which can take on an infinite amount of different manifestations for different people. And like much OCD, there's nothing rational about it, and yet it still holds power over someone. And Jack knew very well that this was irrational. He very much understood that it's weird. People don't have this fear like I do. It's not normal. It doesn't make sense. I'm sure my breath is probably fine, but what if it's not? That core fear still lingered there. It still held power over him, and there was always some ease, some relief when he engaged in a compulsion to reduce that risk, to avoid people. There was that sense of safety that kept the fear alive. So when was that breaking point for Jack? After the pandemic ended, people started going back to work. People started seeing other people. And his job, he worked virtually for an IT company, and it required him to return back to the office. Also, his family too was growing frustrated and very concerned about him. He had to cut a lot of them off from his life so that he could maintain his avoidance, basically, of them. And so this led to depression, a lot more anxiety, feeling very isolated and like nothing will ever get better. He kind of resigned himself to, this is my life and it's only ever going to get smaller. And things did get very, very hopeless and dangerous for him. Luckily, he did reach out for help in the last minute. And yes, as you can probably imagine, such a serious case of fear of OCD was not easy to treat. It took a while for him to get better, but he did. And let me walk you through how. First, he just had to start seeing someone, and even just talking about the fear, sharing it with someone, helped to some degree, helped distill some of the shame and the guilt around it, and have a better understanding of it. And that helped bring down some of the anxiety, at least bring down the edge and make it feel less hopeless. And then he started to engage in exposure response therapy with a trained therapist. And this allowed him to start to pick away at some of these fears, of teaching his brain that, hey, I can sit in an office and maybe even just for a moment, bring down my mask and nobody will grow offended. My world will not collapse, even though it feels like it will. And of course, this was also accompanied by medication management. It was brought up to a high dose of an SSRI under close supervision, and this also started to really chip away at the degree of his anxiety and OCD symptoms and helped him better engage in exposure response therapy. The progress took months. It was definitely slow and very anxiety-inducing, but he stuck with it. He knew he had no alternative. And after a while, he even began to joke about it. So here, I want to share with you the core pillars of all fear. And this case is an extreme example, right? OCD, of course, is a very extreme example of this. Most people who have anxiety don't have OCD, but most people, I would argue all people have anxiety at some point to some degree in their life. So what are some of the takeaways from Jack's case that you can apply to your own life? Because here's the thing, if Jack could tackle his anxiety, his extreme OCD anxiety, I can guarantee you there's no anxiety, no fear that you can't tackle in your life as well. It just requires an understanding of the three pillars that underscore all anxiety. So let's get to them. Number one, like I kind of already mentioned, shame and secrecy. All fears have some degree of shame and secrecy. We don't want to share them. We worry about how they'll reflect on us, but fear always grows in the dark. Even just saying it out loud to someone you trust and love can cut 30% of that anxiety. Second, avoidance. It continues to prop up that anxiety. And so that means that facing it, not avoiding it, starts to starve the anxiety, starts to take away its power. And that's how exposure therapy works. It teaches your brain that you can experience a fear, face it, sit with it, and you won't die. For Jack, this looked like slowly pulling down on his mask inside a therapist's office, just the two of them, opposite sides of the room, but that was enough to trigger a lot of anxiety. He was sweating bullets doing this, and yet he was able to do it. And step by step, he was able to teach his brain, hey, I won't die, I won't survive this. The degree to which you're warning me about this, triggering my anxiety, is no longer warranted. It's not warranted, it's not necessary here. And so your brain starts to adapt. It starts to learn, okay, I was scared of this, I survived it. Maybe next time I won't need to trigger that degree of anxiety. Of course, it's a slow progressing sort of progress, but it's there and it starts to chip away at that anxiety like nothing else. The third one's kind of controversial. Not everybody agrees with this, but I think it's really, really important in this conversation. And that's that your fear is kind of absurd. At the end of the day, core fears are kind of irrational. If they were very irrational, then they should be there. You should be worried about that thing, right? If I'm driving on the highway, my brakes give out and my engine starts steaming and I'm very afraid, that's not a core fear I should ignore. I should listen to that. But on the other hand, many core fears are very, very absurd to some degree. And even if they're not, even if they are, like, a common core fear is if I mess up, if I lose my job, my family will suffer and everything will fall apart. It's not an absurd fear. It's not funny. But if you kind of are able to give that lens of the degree to which this is controlling my life and actually preventing me from engaging in things that will prevent that outcome or feel more fulfilled with the things I do have in my life and the safety I do currently have in my current life, then it does start to become absurd. And that is such a crucial, important aspect of this, is a fear, if it's not being taken seriously, all the power just melts. Like it doesn't exist. Because you can't laugh at something and be terrified of it at the same time. Laughing at the thing that scares you makes it less scary. Prove me wrong. And I think that's a thing that I always try to gauge with my patients when I work with them on their anxiety and OCD. Early on, I get a sense of, very subtly, of how seriously do they take it and what degree of humor are they able to introduce to it. And the less of that there is, that tells me the more work we have to do. And the more they're able to introduce humor and just view it as ridiculous and absurd and name it so, then I know we've made serious progress. It doesn't eliminate it, but it really knocks down its power. Like when I work with people who have violent or sexual intrusive thoughts that kind of pop up, we start to try to label them as these silly brain farts, these odd little manifestations of how our brain sometimes creates images, apparently. And that's all it is. It's just a brain fart. It's nothing more. Don't give it too much meaning. Don't give it too much seriousness. Don't give it too much power, because then it will start to take power over you. So my friends, you may not be afraid of your breath like Jack was, but I'm sure there is something you are afraid of, something holding you back. And I hope this story teaches you that even in the most extreme cases, if you're able to understand that fear and then challenge it, you can reclaim control over your life. One final note about Jack, it's not an actual case I treated in my clinic, in my practice. It's a case I was told about during my training by a mentor to help illustrate the points around what props up anxiety, how it manifests in people, in a very unique situation where that kind of manifested. And I've treated many cases of OCD since, and they all take on these kind of sometimes irrational forms that can be very dominating in people's lives. So it really illustrates how this can happen. And I hope you find some of the lessons from today's video useful, and perhaps applicable to your own lives, to tackle any fear and the anxiety that comes up. And of course, that if it is very dominating of your thoughts of your life, definitely seek out mental health support to help with your symptoms. Thank you so much for those of you who watched to the end. I really appreciate it. It goes a long way. And definitely check out my future videos because I want to share more cases with you and talk about more related topics. If there's any topic you want to hear about, definitely let me know in the comments below. I'd love to make a video on it. Thanks and see you next week.
Ooh, breath stinks.